We were discussing the anointing at Bethany last week, and we nearly finished, except for, we'll finish discussing it, and then we'll read some more from St. Matthew's Gospel. But the last thing to discuss in the anointing at Bethany is Jesus' response, where he says in verse 11 of chapter 26, "For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." So for many people, that has kind of been interpreted as a sort of an observation that the poor are always going to be present because in some sense it's their own fault. And, so Jesus is in some sense lessening the obligation to look after the poor. So does that make sense? Do we agree with that?
I think he's just trying to, I don't think he's trying to lessen it, but he's trying to say that his time is near and that this is really profound what she's doing, and there's a good reason why.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think he's trying to make less of taking care of the poor.
No.
Or the responsibility of it.
No, he's definitely not. This has, his statement actually has an Old Testament parallel, which we should look at. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 11. At the end of every, so this is the sabbatical year. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release. And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release. But there will be no poor among you, for the Lord will bless you in the land which the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance to possess, if only you will obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all this commandment which I command you this day. For the Lord your God will bless you as he promised you, and you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. And you shall rule over many nations, but they shall not rule over you. If there is among you a poor man, one of your brethren, in any of your towns within your land, which the Lord your God gives you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Take heed lest there be a base thought in your heart, and you say, the 7th year, the year of release is near, and your eye be hostile to your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry to the Lord against you, and it be sin in you. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him, because for this the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake. For the poor will never cease out of the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor in the land. So there's the injunction to give to the poor, and then it says, for the poor will never cease out of the land, which almost seems sort of to contradict much of what has gone before. So why is it that the poor will never cease out of the land?
Because there will always be people that will be greedy and right.
Exactly.
I mean, there's going to be poor because there's always going to be somebody that wants to take advantage.
Right. Right. Deuteronomy identifies poverty as the result of human oppression and human sin. And so when Jesus says that there will always be poor among you, he's echoing Deuteronomy, that there are always poor because there are always those who seek to oppress and gain at the expense of the poor. What's also striking in that passage from Deuteronomy is that it talks about blaming the poor for their poverty and hardening your heart against them. And we see that constantly in the depiction of the poor and the treatment of the poor, that the poor are lazy, that the poor don't want to work, that they're different from us hardworking people, that they're ungrateful, that they don't deserve it. And so, there's this whole really character assassination for people against people who are poor. So Jesus.
There's some of that in everything. You know what I mean? There's always a mixture of people taking advantage of the situation, people unfortunately being in the situation because they couldn't, because of hard times. So you're always going to get somebody that spoils it for everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although the people who spoil it are a small proportion of the total who are being ruined. So it's easy to select them as an example, but the reality is that they're a drop in the bucket compared to the total problem, which is that people are poor. So
yeah, with the pandemic, it's a good example of how people have taken advantage of other people's conditions. I mean, look at the cost of food has gone up so ridiculously. Right. Cost of airline flights has gone up ridiculously.
Right.
Just everything. And it's no wonder people have lost their houses and everything, right?
The cost and availability of toilet paper.
Oh, yeah. Right. So, I mean, whenever you have a situation, there's always people that either take advantage of the situation or when you have with this pandemic, there's been a lot of more people suffering.
Yeah. So in a lot of ways, this is very much like the bill of divorce for Moses. It represents the hardness of heart of people. It's not God's will that there be poor. In fact, it says it isn't, that because entering the promised land, people will be blessed by God's provision. There should be enough for everybody, but there's a recognition that there won't be because some are greedy and some will take at the expense of others. And in fact, that's why there's the sabbatical year and then the Jubilee year, because of hardness of heart. So, so you were right, Carmen. So after Jesus' death, what this also really, remember the comment about the bridegroom when John's disciples came to Jesus and asked why his disciples don't fast. And Jesus said that there'll be plenty of time for fasting when, that it's inappropriate to fast while the bridegroom is here. You don't go to the wedding and fast because that indicates your disapproval of the marriage. So that comment applies here as well. There's plenty of occasion to look after the poor but there's only one occasion to anoint the bridegroom and prepare him for burial. That's before his burial. So, any other thoughts or comments or questions about oh, there's one other thing about the anointing. So it contrasts with the disciples, but it's also, in some sense, we can see it as an enactment of the second part of the Olivet Discourse. So this is a woman who's prepared. She's come prepared. She's doing what needs to be done under the circumstances and for the occasion. She recognizes what that is. She's a person who's prepared.
Why is it that people aren't realizing it or understanding that that is coming? I mean, there's very few people that actually know this, and she's one of the very few people that take them seriously.
That's a good point. She contrasts with the disciples who completely bungle it,
and they're around him all the time.
And he told them repeatedly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a good question and one that's difficult to answer. I mean, we tend to, it's kind of like we tend usually to see things, in kind of glorified terms. And I think that's always been, the case. So, the reality is that, Jesus calls us to be a people of sacrifice. And sacrifice involves just that, sacrifice. And he tells us that if we are a people of sacrifice, we'll draw near to God, which is the reward. But, we often see the reward as, all of this stuff God has blessed us with, some of which, is kind of dubious, like, the evangelists and God blessing them with airplanes and bigger airplanes. It seems unlikely that that's exactly God's will.
Well, I mean, I thank him all the time for, the roof over my head, the air that I breathe, the water that I can drink.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we do have a lot to be thankful for.
We have a great deal to be thankful for. And yet and we should be thankful for everything. And yet the major gift isn't the stuff that God gives us, however both necessary it is and great it is.
Schwab when you need it.
Yeah, but the gift is God.
Yeah, no, I know.
And so, but that transition, is sort of a difficult one because we all both, live in this world, and we hopefully recognize that we're only sojourners in this world, but most of us don't.
Well, that's what makes me think that this might be Lazarus' sister, because their belief in Christ was a lot deeper than a lot of other people.
Uh-huh. Yeah. That's possible.
They said, if you had have only been here, you wouldn't have been dead.
Yeah, that's possible. That's John's version. So, it's difficult to tell. whether it was Mary or whether it was an unknown woman who Mary, John decided to name Mary, or whether it was Mary and Matthew decided to not name her. Yeah. So, and then the other thing, is that it's kind of like looking for a sign, like the Pharisees want a sign to show that Jesus is the Messiah. We have all of this bogus teaching about the signs that are going to accompany the second coming. There are wars and rumors of war, and there's whatever and whatever. And then the second coming is near, when the reality is that Jesus explicitly makes it clear there are no signs. So we're looking for something because then we can get prepared. But unless there are the signs, we're not prepared because it's not going to happen. And in that sense, in some sense, it repeats the issue of the Pharisees asking for the sign. The point of Jesus saying there will be no sign is that they are the sign. The eschatological events happened in periods of great idolatry, and looking for the sign is an example of idolatry. It's that you don't trust God. You don't do what God has called you to do. You need a sign. So God has to give you a sign so that you have to get prepared for the time. Why can't you just be prepared?
Exactly.
There's no need for a sign.
Yeah. I mean, if Christ doesn't even know, only the Father knows, then why are we?
Right. Why are we supposed to know? And people think they know in great detail. They give dates, although they constantly need to revise them. But they think they know. Yeah, they think they know more than Jesus, which is also an act of idolatry. Shameful. Mm-hmm. So anything else about the anointing at Bethany? So in that case, let's read a bit more in St. Matthew's Gospel. Let's read about Judas's betrayal and the preparation for the Passover. Hopefully we have less than an hour left, but hopefully we'll get through those two. I want to leave a lot of time I don't want to get into the Last Supper tonight, or, I want to start it as a separate kind of unit since we're going to be spending a good deal of time on it. So chapter 26, verse 14. Then one of the 12, who is called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to such a one and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. When it was evening, he sat at table with the 12 disciples. And as they were eating, he said, 'Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me.' And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, 'Is it I, Lord?' He answered, 'He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Is it I, Master?" He said to him, "You have said so." He actually says, "Is it I, Rabbi?" Or is it I, teacher, not master? Jesus said to him, "You have said so." So we start with the betrayal. Let's look at the other two versions of the betrayal in Mark and Luke. It's Mark chapter 14, verses 10 and 11. So you notice that in Matthew's gospel, Jesus asks, "How much will you give me?" In Mark, it's a reward rather than solicited by Jesus. Verse 10, then Judas Iscariot was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him. So the amount isn't solicited, it's given as a reward out of glee. And there's no mention of the 30 pieces of silver. In Luke, it's chapter 22, verses 3 through 6. Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and engaged to give him money. So he agreed and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of the multitude. So we have, in the absence of the multitude, we have, again, the offer of the money that comes from the chief priest. It's not solicited by Judas, and there's no mention of 30 pieces of silver. Why 30 pieces of silver? Does anyone have any idea? So one of the things that is sort of striking here is that when we look at the exchange, when the disciples ask, "Is it I? Is it I, Lord?" That contrasts with Judas. "Is it I, Rabbi? Is it I, teacher?" So similarly, silver. Let's go back to the missionary discourse earlier.
In Matthew?
In Matthew chapter 10, verse 9. Let's start at verse 7 when we get there. "And preach as you go, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You receive without pay, give without pay. Take no gold, nor silver, nor copper in your belts, nor bag for your journey, nor 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. So take no gold, no silver," and Judas is taking silver. And then he's also called Jesus Rabbi, and Jesus had earlier said not to call him Rabbi. It's chapter 23, verse 8. "But you are not to be called Rabbi by men." Rabbi is a teacher. "But you are not to be called Rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brethren." So Jesus was not to be called teacher. He was instead addressed by the rest of the disciples as Kyrie, Lord. But Judas calls him Rabbi, and Judas takes silver. So it's a striking kind of confirmation of Judas's lack of faithfulness, lack of adherence, lack of discipleship.
You know, was it in Luke that wrote that Judas became possessed by Satan when he was going to turn Jesus to?
That was Luke.
That was in Luke, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he did say that. So, I mean, isn't that just the first time we hear that Satan enters Judas?
I think it's also in John.
Oh, it is in John too? We
it's
didn't
in
go
both.
to John.
Luke has it, Satan entered him when he went and asked for the money. Yeah. And I think that in John, Satan entered him when he leaves the Last Supper and goes to inform on Jesus. 30 pieces of silver is also the value of a slave who's gored by an ox. Let's take a look at that. It's Exodus chapter 21, verse 32. Actually, it's interesting to read about people being gored by oxen doing damage and what the recompense should be. So let's start at verse 25.
Chapter 21?
21, Exodus 21, chapter 25.
Okay.
When an ox scores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be clear. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. If a ransom is laid on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is laid upon him. If it gores a man's son or daughter, he shall be dealt with according to the same rule. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. So Jesus is basically worth the cost of a slave gored by an ox to Judas. In the Septuagint, in old versions of the Septuagint, very old versions of the Septuagint, there was also a mistaken, an error in translation, so that it said that Joseph was sold by his brothers for 30 pieces of silver, whereas the actual number in the Masoretic text was 20 pieces of silver. And Jerome pointed that out. But the thing that's related about it is that so Joseph was sold, betrayed by his brothers for money. And then in Genesis chapter 50, he points out the paradox of what his brothers had done as he forgives them. So it's not clear. It's actually possible that Matthew also had this in mind if he had seen the Septuagint version that said 30 pieces of, that Joseph was sold for 30 pieces of silver. But it's also possible that he had it in mind vaguely anyway, because Joseph was betrayed by those closest to him and those who should have loved him and wanted to care for him, but instead betrayed him. So in some sense, I mean, we can see that as sort of a type of Jesus. So in chapter So they have a reunification, and in verse 20, starting in 19, Joseph says, "But Joseph said to them, 'Fear not, for I am in the place of God. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today.'" So that's sort of the paradox of Jesus and Judas, that Judas means it for evil and that God will bring good out of it in some mysterious way that we really don't. That is a mystery. God works all things, including evil, for ultimate good. Incidentally, what's also sort of shocking is that although 30 pieces of silver is the amount that's supposed to be given to the owner of a slave that was gored by an ox, the value of the 30 pieces of silver was 1/10 of its value at the time of the Exodus. So fundamentally, Judas, it's insulting enough to be sold for the value of a slave gored by an ox. But this value had depreciated, so Judas ended up selling Jesus' life for a paltry sum. So there's been a lot of speculation about Judas's motive. John says that he controlled the money. It's in John, but Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" This he said not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. As he had the money box, he used it to take what was put into it. So in John's version, Judas is outraged that the 300 denarii that he could have stolen becomes unavailable, and he decides in the end to settle for 300 shekels, which is a significantly smaller quantity, a smaller amount. Judas Iscariot is Iscariot is not related to the name of his father. So the question is, what does Iscariot mean? And the two most likely possibilities is that it's the town he comes from. Iscariot would mean man of Kerioth. And the only towns named Kerioth are in southern Judea and in Moab. So they're not in Galilee, which means that Judas would not be a Galilean, which means that he would, in some sense, stick out like a sore thumb from the other 11 disciples in Jesus who were Galileans. And, given the general disdain and view of Galileans as being, sort of uncultured and backward and, a bit slow. When in Judea, he may have felt very uncomfortable with that. The second possibility is that Iscariot is a derivation of Sicarios. and they were members of a revolutionary group that wanted to violently overthrow the Romans. So in that case, Jesus talking about he's going to be handed over and he's going to die and whatever is not exactly something that would appeal to someone who's hoping for the revolutionary overthrow of the Romans. That doesn't quite get it done. And so that may also be true. And then Chrysostom argues that it was that part of the reason for Judas's betrayal was not so much that his revolutionary aspirations were not going to be met. It's that Chrysostom says then when he heard, that is, that he heard that this gospel should be preached everywhere, for that made him afraid, as it was indeed a mark of an unspeakable power. So it was the success, the potential success, and especially the promise of the spread of the gospel beyond the Israelites and to the Gentiles that caused him to draw back. So there's sort of rich speculation, but the only firm answer provided comes from John, who said that he was a thief. And Matthew implies as well that he's greedy, since he takes what he can get. And, it's a paltry sum, but it's something. There's also an attempt to rehabilitate Judas and, to make him out to be not such a bad guy. There's a view that the demonization of Jesus was a product of the later church. So and it's based on the fact that the word for betray that Matthew uses is paradidomi. But the more specific word for betray that Matthew, in the opinion of this argument, should have used is prodidomi. So paradidomi sort of means more like to hand through, and prodidomi means to hand over to. So the argument was that the reality of Judas's betrayal may have been more nuanced, so that Jesus was merely an honest broker who was attempting to arrange a constructive dialogue between Jesus and his opponents. And the fact that he failed was the cause of his bitter remorse that we'll study in the next chapter of Matthew, in verses 3 to 5 of chapter 27. And then there's also, there's a Gospel of Judas that was somewhat recently discovered and has been really widely publicized. I haven't read it since I, don't not impressed by these things particularly. So a number of scholars who work with, interpret New Testament and related documents have written a great deal about it, and seen it as insightful and exciting and whatever. So it depicts Judas's actions as basically done in obedience to Jesus' commands, since the other disciples hadn't learned the true gospel. And indeed, we can see them struggling with what Jesus is trying to say them. But it's basically a second century Gnostic gospel from somewhere between the mid to the late second century. And it's possible that it's based on a Coptic, originally written in Coptic, so possibly around 130 to 170, so somewhere between about a century after Jesus' death.
Where did they find it?
I don't remember. I've paid minimal attention. I haven't read the Gospel of Judas. I haven't read the books about the Gospel of Judas. I mean, I used to go to the Jesus seminars, so I did go to one lecture about it. But so, I'm sort of dwelling on it because, I mean, it's I think, important, not so much in itself as in a kind of a general instance of something else. So we always hear about the lost books of the Bible.
Yeah.
And there's this view that, the mean, nasty, and evil fathers of the church have suppressed the true books of the Bible, that they've woven this narrative that is fundamentally false, that they have distorted who Jesus was. And so these lost books of the Bible correct the narrative, or in some cases provide the true narrative. And, we can learn a great deal from them. So the problem with that is, first of all, that there's always a fudging of dates. So, so for example, at least I think it's very clear that almost the entire corpus of the New Testament was written before the destruction of the temple, although as a corpus, it didn't come together until the 4th century. But nevertheless, the books of the New Testament were in existence, except for John's gospel, by the destruction of the temple. But most scholars, so-called, disagree with that, and they tend to push the dates later and later. And they also tend to focus on the way each gospel writer is concerned with the context of their own community and the conditions within their own community. So Matthew was presumably written in Antioch. So Matthew is ostensibly very concerned with the Jewish community in Antioch. John was written in Ephesus. So John is evidently, very focused on the Jewish Christian community in Ephesus. And Mark was written in Rome and is, focused on conditions in Rome, as well as sort of trying to write in all three cases, combining local conditions with Jesus' ministry. But the problem with that, is that it involves a great deal of speculation about conditions in one's own community. It also tends to be accompanied by pushing the dates back too late. And it partly misses the point. I mean, so on the one hand, the Gospels aren't, and we've talked about this before, the Gospels aren't intended to be so much a history as they're intended to be, I guess you could say, a historical theology. They're not, the writers aren't necessarily reporting events chronologically. They're ordering them in a way that they believe makes sense given the message that they're trying to convey about Jesus' ministry. So the important thing is, who was Jesus? And what does Jesus call us to do? And what does the ministry of Jesus and the life of Jesus tell us about God? In what way does it reveal God to us? And so a lot of that gets lost when we begin to move dates back and focus on, sort of sundry considerations that are highly speculative. And what also clearly happens is that we begin to lose sense of the continuity and the unity of each gospel. So as we've been looking at Matthew's gospel, I think we've been seeing that it's very tightly woven, that there really aren't very sharp transitions, that it's carefully crafted, carefully thought out, and that it's a theological masterpiece. But a lot of that gets lost when, what are the conditions? Why is Matthew saying this? What's happening in his community? And, how does this fit in with the preaching of the 2nd century or whatever church? And, we lose it. So this focus on the lost books is and first of all of those lost books were not suppressed from the Bible. They were never, many of them were not lost. Many of them were known to the fathers. They're written later. Many of them are Gnostic works. They're almost all heretical works. And, they provide insight into the either the philosophy or the theology of some of the heretical groups. But in the case of, say, the Gnostics, the I wouldn't call it theology. I would call it, I'm not sure what I would call it, cosmology. The cosmology of the Gnostics was like insane. I mean, it's like, and so even there, if you look at these as lost books of the Bible, which you really can't do, the message that they contain is non-existent unless you pick and choose what you think is useful to contradict the orthodox view of Christianity, which is, fundamentally illicit. We have to look at a work as a whole, as well as its parts, but we have to begin by looking at a work as a whole. And when you do that, this makes no sense. The heretical works make no sense. So whenever you encounter, the lost books of the Bible and those mean, nasty fathers have suppressed the truth and have changed the narrative and whatever, you should always push back, because the contention is ridiculous. And it's shocking, actually, that intelligent people, especially scholars, actually believe this garbage.
They believe in that really because they believe in that, because they wanted to prove a point.
I think that they want to prove a point. I think that, it's convenient. I mean, the basic view of many is that the Gospels are unreliable and that, well, the Gospels are historically unreliable, and that Christianity was diverse, which in its early years, which certainly was true, but that at its root, Jesus was fundamentally a moral and ethical philosopher as a Jewish holy man, rather than as the Messiah, rather than as the Son of God. That Christology was added later. And but I think that that's completely, misguided. I mean, Jesus, I think very clearly even if we look at Jesus merely as part of the Old Testament prophetic tradition, although the prophets called people to engage in moral behavior and to live as God had commanded, the important part of their call to obedience isn't that, we become morally good or whatever. It's that we grow close to God. We do what God has called us to do, and God is the reward. Jesus' message is that the kingdom of God is at hand, so that we can live in the present in God's kingdom if we trust God, and we can live eternally in the future in God's kingdom if we trust God. And we can have resurrected bodies in the new heaven and the new earth if we trust and love God and walk in his ways. So that's, I think, much more than being a moral and an ethical philosopher, or, kind of a nice guy. Saying, in a lot of ways, certainly it is true that Jesus was meek, but he was also confrontational when need be. And somehow, in terms of the sense of Jesus as the moral and ethical philosopher, he fell somewhat short of the standard, I think, of being a nice guy. I mean, that's not a criticism. That's a strength, but so in some sense, I mean, this is, actually is really kind of part of the liberal German schools' attack on the church and on the gospel. We discussed that. I mean, I think very early in the class, that they sort of have tried to reinterpret everything, that they've used Q, which is an imaginary document, to interpret how the Gospels were formed, something that no historian in their right mind should ever conceive of doing. I mean, you however good or bad your sources are, you don't invent sources. You just don't do that. I mean, if say, I mean, I studied medieval Russian history, for example, a little bit. And, there's an amazing paucity of sources. So, it's great if you could just invent your own. But you can't do that. When I was a Russian social historian, I was a labor historian. And large portions of the Russian working class are illiterate, and so they left for themselves no real written records. Especially, I studied the textile workers in central Russia, who were very often from recent peasant backgrounds, and so they were almost invariably illiterate. They leave no records. Now, it would be great if you can surmise your records, right? Then, but you can't do that. That's just unethical. We're bound by the evidence we have, and we can't cook our books. So, I find this whole thing just ridiculous and outrageous and shocking that large parts of it, for example, the existence of Q is accepted by almost all mainstream scholars, including Catholics. I don't understand how, that's even possible. And accepted by, including many very good scholars whose works are generally reliable, except for how they, try to figure out how Matthew drew on Mark and why he changed him and what Q said and whatever. So, this is just an important thing to keep an eye out for. And I probably spent much too much time berating it.